For the alliance's annual two-day summit. Ukraine is expected to dominate the conversation there, but the China threat is also in focus.
Everything for China is about that long-term strategy of becoming that world economic superpower by 2049, and they have not been shy about saying that. So it's military, it's economics, and it's diplomatic relations, and that's exactly what they've done. They're strategically buying up and using funds to secure ports, to secure those critical minerals around the world. Again, while we've been asleep at the wheel for 40 years. So we are absolutely aware of this. It is a huge threat, and I do think China, the Communist Party of China, is our #1 adversary and threat.
First of all, we're seeing desperate middle-class Chinese. These are generally not poor people because they can afford to pay $35,000 a head to the Mexican cartels to bring them in. But among them are packs of males of between 5 and 15 who are of military age, not coming with family groups, pretending not to speak English, and engaging in Chinese military rituals like drinking blood. A border section patrol chief said that some of them are known to have Chinese military affiliations. So clearly these are saboteurs coming into America to wage war on the United States on the first day that there is war in Asia.
That is just drinking blood.
Good afternoon. My name is Scott Ritter. Allow me to introduce myself for those who don't know me. I'm a former United States Marine Corps intelligence officer. I participated in Operation Desert Storm and served as the Chief Weapons Inspector for the United Nations in Iraq. My main interests are international relations and armed conflicts in different parts of the world. I am convinced that we all should know a little more about a person who, to the applause of those I call the global elite, is ready to fight to the last Ukrainian, President Volodymyr Zelensky. Mr. President, there have been numerous publications about you, but everything seems to disappear from the web. Your image is carefully managed and not without reason. You immediately understood why I named my film Agent Zelensky, didn't you? Let's begin.
Well, I welcome on the program the amazing Scott Ritter. Scott, welcome to tonight and today's program where you are, everyone. Before I move on with this show, I have to tell you that Scott has a follow-up to that very video that we just saw in the introduction. But without further ado, I'm going to move right over to you, Scott, and maybe you could tell the audience a little bit about yourself. I know we had that little bit of intro, but there's much more behind you, and I'd like you to introduce our audiences here a little bit more and tell us about your background.
Well, I mean, I consider myself an all-American kid, born into a military family. Both my parents were Air Force, career Air Force officers. I'm a child of the Cold War. My father was deployed. He did a couple tours in Vietnam. Near the end of his career, we were in Hawaii during the drawdown of the Vietnam conflict. Then we moved to Turkey, which was on the front lines of the Cold War, then to West Germany, which is really on the front lines. And, I think people today don't understand what it was like living back then, especially if you were a military brat and your parents were deployed overseas in territories, nations that were directly opposite from the Soviet Union during the Cold War. It was called a Cold War because it was a war, but we didn't have the fighting. But we had militaries faced off against one another, and there was just a constant tension, a constant threat of conflict. And this is the environment I grew up in, and as a result, I was imbued with a sense of patriotism, a desire to serve my country, to defend my country against the evil empire. And when I graduated high school, I enlisted in the United States Army. Later, I transitioned to the United States Marine Corps, got my commission, and became an intelligence officer, again, with this singular focus of going to war with the Soviet Union. I literally woke up every morning thinking about nothing but that for several years. I was a Russian history major, had a couple years of Russian language under my belt, was researching and writing on issues pertaining to the Soviet Union and Russia. And I think because of this, in 1987, when Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, that's the treaty that for the first time in the history of the nuclear era, the two nuclear powers decided that instead of limiting the growth of nuclear weapons, they were going to start reducing them, eliminating them. And we got rid of an entire category of nuclear weapons, the intermediate range missiles that had been deployed by the United States into Western Europe. The Soviets had theirs in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And this treaty got rid of them. And I played an important role in that. I am proud to say that I was literally the first inspector on the ground in the Soviet Union at that time. It was more accident than design, but I still get to claim the honor and privilege of that distinction. And I spent the next 2.5 years implementing this treaty, a very important treaty. It set the stage for all future arms control agreements. And it was the first time in the history of arms control that on-site inspection was used as a means of compliance verification. That is, human beings going onto the soil of the other party and carrying out intrusive inspections to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to do. We inspected them, they inspected us. And again, I like to say that I helped write the book on on-site inspection. When that is in the military, you don't get to do anything forever, and eventually my time was up, and I had to return back to the Marine Corps. I did so in the summer of 1990. In August of 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Iraq, and I got thrown into that conflict. I was pulled out of the school that I was attending, and I was given the task of assisting a special cell created by the Commandant of the Marine Corps to plan amphibious combat operations against the Iraqis. I helped design a couple options that were briefed, approved by the Commandant, and sent to General Schwarzkopf, who was the commander of U.S. forces in the Middle East. He didn't like that idea, but it was an interesting exercise nonetheless, one that got, I guess, my profile elevated, and I was sent to General Schwarzkopf's staff just in time for the war to start. This was Operation Desert Storm, the war that was supposed to liberate Kuwait. Because I had been a missile inspector in the Soviet Union, I became known as the missile guy. And when Scud started, the Iraqis started firing these Soviet-made Scud missiles into Israel and into the Arabian Peninsula, that became my focus: how to find a way to interdict these missiles. And so that was my war. I worked with the Air Force. I worked with British and American Special Forces. In an effort to do this, I can say that we didn't kill a single Scud missile. It was a difficult target. We tried very hard, but the Iraqis were pretty good, and it just was an impossible task. And the war ended sort of with this level of frustration. While we had defeated the Iraqis on the ground in battle, the missile war, I think it's safe to say they won. And I think that combined with the fact that these missiles, Iraq had threatened Israel with them the summer before, meant that even though when the war ended, Saddam Hussein was still in power, the goal and objective of the United States was to get rid of Saddam and get rid of his weapons of mass destruction. And in April of 1991, the United Nations Security Council passed a resolution, 687, which authorized the creation of an organization, the United Nations Special Commission, an inspection organization, to go into Iraq and oversee the elimination of ballistic missiles, these Scud missiles, chemical weapons, biological weapons, and nuclear weapons. I wasn't part of this initially. I actually, when the war ended, I made a decision that I was going to get out of the Marine Corps. I had joined the Marine Corps for the purpose of killing Russians, just being honest. And the Cold War was over. I had spent 2.5 years working with the Soviets, working with the Russians. Peace was breaking out all over. And I had fought my war. I had served my country. I'd done my duty. And I thought it was time to move on. But in The Godfather, there's that scene where he says, every time I try to get out, they just drag me back. And that's what happened here. The Iraqis, unfortunately, were cheating. They had significant quantities of weapons of mass destruction. They declared less than half of their chemical weapons, less than half of their ballistic missiles. They denied having a biological or nuclear program. And the inspection teams that were created were done so, I guess I call them gentleman teams. These were teams of genuine experts who went in, whose job was simply to do verification. You receive a list, you confirm that what's on the list is there, then you oversee the disposition. But they weren't configured to hunt for hidden things. They weren't configured to uncover the lies. And once it became clear that the Iraqis are lying, the United Nations needed to come up with a new way, a new approach. And I was brought in to create an intelligence unit, an intelligence capability to gather information about how the Iraqis were hiding weapons, where they were hiding them, and then to help build specialized inspection teams that would go into Iraq in a very aggressive, intrusive fashion, try to find these weapons. And I started that job in September of 1991. And I did that job until August of 1998. It was one of the more intense experiences of my life. What I can say is when we started, Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. There's a lot of people today say, well, Iraq never had WMD. Well, they did, actually. The reason why they didn't at the end is because of people like me. We went in there and we got rid of these weapons. We found them, we destroyed them, we pressured the Iraqis to tell the truth. And after years of lying, of hiding, of cheating, because of the tenaciousness of the inspection teams, the Iraqis finally did tell the truth. But the problem with liars is if you lie for a long period of time, it's difficult to know when you've stopped lying and when you started telling the truth. And unfortunately for the Iraqis, the international community wasn't prepared to accept the fact that they had been disarmed. I resigned from my job as a weapons inspector in August of 1998 out of frustration over the role played by the United States in interfering with the work of inspectors. It was my job and the job of the other inspectors to find the truth. And we had disarmed Iraq in a documented fashion to a 95 to 97% level. We had gotten rid of just about everything, and we knew it. We knew what they had. We knew what we destroyed, and we had a good understanding of what was missing, but we couldn't prove that what was missing had been eliminated. We blew the heck out of that country during the war, blew up a lot of stuff. And then as the inspections progressed, we were very good, very aggressive. The Iraqis panicked, and so they took what they were hiding and they blew it up and buried it under the ground to try and deny that they ever did it. And then we had to uncover the fact that they had lied, that they had this stuff. Then they took us to the ground where they had blown it up and buried it. And we had to dig it out of the ground like forensic investigators, like bringing up old bodies, literally lay out the parts and try and breathe life into it to see what was there and account for it. And we knew that the stuff that was unaccounted for probably wasn't viable, probably didn't exist. But even if it did exist, so many years had passed that it wasn't viable. That didn't matter. The Security Council said 100%, and 97% ain't 100%. So it was my job to find out what happened to the last 3%, which means we had to really put the screws on the Iraqis, really dig in there and get this done. But the United States wasn't interested in me coming up with 100%. They wanted me and the other inspectors to destabilize Iraq, to create the perception that Iraq was non-compliant, that Iraq still had significant quantities so they could justify a policy of regime change. And that wasn't the duty of the inspectors. And so I resigned. I said, I'm not going to play that game. I'm a purist. If you give me a job, I'm going to do the job, but I'm not going to play games. So I resigned and I started speaking out against a U.S. policy in the Middle East. And I guess I've been a critic ever since. Some people say that that's, sort of unpatriotic. I say it's actually the most patriotic thing a man could do. I'm often reminded that I remind myself that I didn't take an oath to serve the president of the United States or to serve any individual or even government. I took an oath to defend the Constitution. Now, the Constitution, talks about how we create a government, who's in the government, but I'm defending the Constitution, not the people. And it's my duty in the Constitution to speak out. And the Supreme Court has said this, that the purpose of free speech is for citizens to hold their government accountable for the lies that they tell, that the government has no right to tell lies, the government has no right to deceive. And it's the responsibility of the citizen, especially if they're empowered with knowledge and information that proves that the government is lying, to speak out. So I consider myself to be extremely patriotic, and I think that it is my duty, especially when it came to Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, to speak out about the lies being told by the United States. I'd like to believe that had we not gone to war in Iraq, there would be thousands of Americans who would be alive today, millions of Iraqis who would be alive today, in an entire region that wouldn't be destabilized to the extent that it is. And I've taken this critical eye and applied it to other aspects of U.S. policy. And today I speak out critically about the American approach to Ukraine. I'm somebody who cut my teeth on nuclear disarmament, and I firmly believe that had we not implemented the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty started in 1988, that none of us would be here today, that we would have gone to nuclear war with the Soviet Union and it would have destroyed the world. And I believe that if we don't recapture the spirit of disarmament that we had back then, today, when we only have one treaty left, it's no longer being implemented. And when it expires in 2026, there's nothing to replace it. There will be an arms race. We don't trust the Russians. They don't trust us. Tensions are high. Mistakes will be made. And I think that we're heading down the path where there will be a nuclear conflict again. So again, what is my job as an American? To sit back and let this happen? And what is my job as a parent? To sit back and do nothing while my children's future is squandered by people who seemingly have forgotten the lessons of the past? Or is it my duty as an American, as a parent, as a human, to speak out against bad policy and to promote nuclear disarmament? So that's what I do today. That's where I'm at.
You know, Scott, I'm a little bit concerned about the direction that the American government's going, but also NATO. I'm not sure if we can really touch on this, but let's focus NATO's first invasion in Yugoslavia and what led up to that. I've always wondered, you know, my father was in the military, in the Navy. My grandfather as well was in the Navy. And my father came home one day and he said to me, you know, Americans in NATO, they're going into Yugoslavia. And I said, what on earth are we going in there for? You know, with your experience, I'm not sure how much focus that you've had on that, but maybe you could share some insights on, you know, how that really gained traction so quick within, I would say, a week and a half. Everybody was mobilized, and the rest is history. And that is my concern here, that are they still capable of doing that? Was that a one-off? I mean, that absolutely obliterated that country with 78 days. You've seen the destruction of what these bombs can do. Maybe you could share some insights, and we'll start with that.
Well, you know, NATO was created in the late 1940s as a defensive organization. There wasn't really a threat. It was sort of exaggerated, but you know, Winston Churchill gave his famous Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri, and from that, a Cold War attitude came in. A national NSC 68, which was a foundational document for the Cold War about containment of the Soviet Union, was promulgated, and we spent decades confronting an ideological confrontation with the Soviet Union, with communist China, that had behind it this significant military capability, especially NATO. A lot of people don't realize that we had a whole bunch of treaty organizations seeking to surround the Soviet Union at the time. We had NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but we had CENTO, the Central Treaty Organization, that included Turkey, Iraq for a little while, Iran, Pakistan. Then we had CETO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, which sought to contain them on the other end. So NATO was just part of an overall strategy of containment. But NATO became the primary focus. Europe became the primary focus of this containment, of this confrontation. But when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, December 25th, 1991 to be exact, you know, NATO sort of lost its reason to exist. The initial Secretary General of NATO, Lord Hastings, famously said about NATO that it was created to keep the Americans in, keep the Germans down, and keep the Russians out. Keep Americans in because, again, study your history and you'll see that, you know, it wasn't automatic that we were going to enter World War II. And, you know, we were an isolationist country. There was a strong isolationist presence in the United States Congress that opposed Franklin Roosevelt's desire to intervene on behalf of Great Britain against Nazi Germany. And it took the Japanese attack against Pearl Harbor to get the United States to shake free of this. And then we mobilized and we became a global power because of this. Bretton Woods, allowed our economy to dominate the world. mobilizing over 12 million soldiers on 2 theaters of operation, gave us a significant military presence. And when the war ended, there was a lot of people that just wanted to bring that all back in and go back to being isolationist. Where America minds its own business, and we're not going to play that game. And one of the things that NATO did was to say, no, America's going to be in Europe permanently. We're going to be there, not just with the Marshall Plan, the reconstruction of Europe. We're going to be there with a significant military force. Okay, defensive. Article 5 is a big deal. The Washington Treaty, the NATO Charter. Article 5 is collective defense. An attack against one is an attack against all. But it required someone to attack NATO because it's a defensive alliance. Now the Cold War ends, no one's going to attack NATO. And literally speaking, there's no reason for NATO to exist. Keeping Germany down didn't matter. 1990, Germany was reunified after the collapse of the Berlin Wall. Germany came together, a peace treaty was signed, and now Germany is united. How can you keep Germany down? It's now a unified country, part of the Western Alliance. Keep the Russians, out. Well, the Russians were leaving voluntarily. The Russians sat down with people in 1990. Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader, said, "We'll take the 450,000 troops out of Eastern Germany, but we need a guarantee from you that NATO won't expand." And there was no reason for NATO to expand. The Russians they're voluntarily leaving. So we promised them not 1 inch eastward, 1 inch eastward. We won't do that. And it was all a lie, because the policy of the United States was to ensure that out of the ashes of the Soviet Union, that a phoenix never arose, that Russia would never again be able to rise up and replicate the challenge to the West that the Soviet Union had presented. And one way that we were going to guarantee that didn't happen was to expand NATO. We knew it from the start. So we lied to them from the very beginning. NATO was transitioning to an expansive organization. But one of the problems that NATO had was this place called Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia had been ruled since the Second World War by a dictator named Tito. And when Tito died in the 1990s, the question was, what was going to happen to Yugoslavia? What would happen to this nation that was actually sort of an amalgam of different ethnic groups: Croatians, Serbia, Muslim Bosnians, Macedonians, Kosovars, Albanians. What's going to happen to this? It was a very tenuous situation. Now, had it been left to its own, its own volition, Yugoslavia may have peacefully, broken up, or it may have come up with a way to redefine itself as a federation. We'll never know, because Germany recognized the independence, I believe, of Croatia and Bosnia. Slovenia broke free. Next thing you know, a civil war is breaking out. And the United Nations was involved. NATO supported the United Nations effort. And it quickly became a situation where the West, United Nations, NATO, were lined up against the Serbs. The Serbs became the bad guys, the enemy. Our allies were the Croats. Our allies were the Bosnians. Our allies were the Kosovars. Now, the breakup of Yugoslavia led to what they call the Dayton Peace Accords. I think they were signed in 1996-ish, around there. Maybe later, I'm not sure. But Serbia still existed, and we viewed Serbia as a threat. There was a strong Serbian position in Bosnia with the Srpska Republic. And the question was, how do we weaken Serbia? And that's literally what this was all about. How do you weaken Serbia? And the way that we were going to do this was to take Kosovo, this province of Kosovo, away from Serbia. We're going to strip it away. In order to do that, we need to have an excuse, justification. And so the CIA worked with this group called the Kosovo Liberation Army to carry out provocations on the soil of Kosovo, to go in and attack Serbian police, to attack the Serbian military, and to try and get the Serbians to retaliate. And then when the Serbians did retaliate, almost always against military-aged men who were wearing suspiciously camouflaged pants and carrying passports that linked them to the Kosovo Liberation Army, they called it a massacre, they being the West. A massacre, a genocide. A genocide was breaking out in Kosovo. There was no genocide taking place in Kosovo. Was there violence? Yes. because the CIA was creating violence and the Serbians responding in kind. But this genocide then was elevated to a threat against the collective security of Europe, which was manifested in NATO. And so NATO declared that they needed to preemptively strike this threat, this imminent threat of genocidal, lunacy taking place in Kosovo by going to war against Serbia. They cited Article 51, collective self-defense, preemptive collective self-defense, and they attacked the Serbs. And as you said, 78, 79 days of bombing, thousands of people dead, mostly civilians. And it broke the back of Serbia. It led to the conditions where the Serbian leader had to resign, eventually was turned over to The Hague for prosecution as a war criminal for what had happened in Bosnia earlier. But this is a NATO that no longer was a defensive alliance. This is a NATO that had transitioned into an offensive-oriented alliance, an alliance that wasn't about defending the collective, but manipulating other nations to achieve an outcome desirable to Europe. It's a totally different mindset, totally different approach. And this is where the current mindset that exists in NATO today, vis-a-vis Ukraine and others, this is where it was born, in Kosovo.
Well, let's shift over to the involvement by the government, the CIA. I mean,